Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Silent Histories. I am, of course, your host, Brian Keene, apologizing in advance because I've got a little bit of a cold, so I may sound a little weird. Today, we are, of course, talking about Terminal because in our chronological history, this is the book that comes next. What I have laid out here before you are the three different versions of the book. This is the original novella, this is the original novel, and this is the author's preferred edition of that novel. The best way to talk about this history is to actually read you the introduction that I wrote to that author's preferred version there on the right. And then when I'm done, we'll take a look at each book in a little more detail, and we'll take a look at some foreign editions and some fancy editions, and we'll talk about its place in my history. But if you'll allow me, I'm gonna read not the entire introduction because it's pretty lengthy, but I want to talk about some of the history here. Of all my published works, none of them has had the history that Terminal has, and in order to understand what the author's preferred edition actually is, what I'd like to do is recount some of that history for you. It's a sordid and at times confusing tale, but I hope you'll allow me this space to tell it because I think it's important. Of all my books, none of them has been more simultaneously rewarding and vexing than Terminal. I remember writing it far more clearly than any other book in my career, except for maybe End of the Road, The Complex, and The Girl on the Glider. And I'm going to pause right here. The version that I'm talking about right now is that version there on your left, the hardcover, with Alan Clark's cover. I began working on it shortly after the success of The Rising caught me, my publishers, and everyone else by surprise. Keep in mind, that was my first published novel. After The Rising hit the bestseller list and was rushed into a second and then third printing, it was suggested to me by both my fans and my publishers that a sequel to The Rising would be required. But that wasn't what I wanted to write. I wanted to write a novella about a white trash, blue-collar guy who is terminally ill, robs a bank, and inadvertently halts the second coming of Christ in the process. I wanted to call the novella Terminal. So I did. I sent a pitch for the sequel to The Rising to my editor at Leisure Books, and then, while I waited to hear back from him, I started the novella. After a few weeks, Leisure approved the idea for the sequel, so I started writing City of the Dead. And I want to pause again from reading the introduction, not only to scratch my eye, which is itching, but to reiterate. I was working on this and City of the Dead at the same time. All right, let's go back to the introduction. Basically, I spent 6 months writing 2 books at the same time. I worked on City of the Dead every morning, then I'd take a lunch break, and then I'd work on Terminal every afternoon. 7 days a week of that for 6 months. Thinking about that now exhausts me. I was younger then, still in my 30s, early 30s, and had more stamina behind the keyboard than I do now. After the first 2 of those months, I finished the novella version of Terminal, but I still had the second half of City of the Dead to finish writing. The novella came out to 52,000 words in length, which was at the time considered too short to be published as a full-length novel, but too long to be published as a short story. That's just one of the many ways in which the publishing business has changed today. At the time, Larry Roberts, who had recently founded a small press company called Bloodletting Press, so I sold Terminal to him as the second book in his novella line. Okay, again, we're still talking about this one, and maybe let's bring that into focus. Okay, so we're still talking about this book. This was going to be the second book in Bloodletting Press's novella line. The same week that I sold this to Larry, I had a discussion with Rich Sanfilippo, a then young editor at Bantam, a division of Random House. Horror fiction was becoming popular again after a 9-year drought. By then, the Leisure Books horror line had several bestsellers in addition to The Rising. The New York Times had run an extensive piece about the new surge in horror fiction, a feature article which focused on myself, J.F. Gonzalez, and Tim Levin, among others. Rich had been tasked with spearheading Bantam's new horror line, which would kick off with books by myself and Tom Piccirilli. Effectively, Tom and I would have been writing horror novels for both Leisure Books and Random House at the same time. So I pitched Rich a full-length novel version of Terminal, a story that would expand upon things only hinted at in the novella version, which is what you're looking at right now. Now, here's where I should stop and tell all of you that I'm not going to spoil Terminal. So if you're watching these secret histories and you haven't actually read the books, it's okay. There's no spoilers this time. The version that I pitched Random House, okay, Bantam, expanded at length upon a certain character's lineage and whom they might really be. And thus, a story about one man's anger at God takes on a much deeper meaning. Rich liked this idea, and Larry was okay with me doing this because the novella he'd published was a limited edition. And so I signed with Bantam, Random House, and immediately went to work on novelizing this novella. I did this in the afternoons, like before, while still working on City of the Dead in the mornings. And I still had a day job at this point, so I was working the night shift on the loading docks at FedEx at that time. Okay, so what I've begun doing now is turning this into this, okay? While still working on City of the Dead and still going to work every night on the loading docks. I don't remember ever being more driven to write at any point in my career than I did during the last 4 of those 6 months. There have been times where I've come close. Dark Hollow, Ghoul, Kill Whitey, The Girl in the Glider, The Complex all came from that same wellspring of maniacal creative drive. But those were singular books. City of the Dead and Terminal were being written simultaneously. Both books were written in a white-hot blaze of stamina and very little sleep. City of the Dead was the fun book, the balls to the wall, let's have fun shooting zombies, take this book to the beach, or study hall novel. In comparison, Terminal was dark and emotional and serious. It left me drained at the end of each night. It was decidedly less fun to write, but far more rewarding creatively. It was also, in my opinion, the first book where I really started to discover my own voice as a writer. My influences are still all over Terminal. When I go back and reread it, I can spot Joe Lansdale, Elmore Leonard, and a lot of Garth Ennis and Stephen King. I consider those echoes, if you will. But I can also see a lot of Brian Keene finally stepping forward with some confidence in his own writer voice. Every author has a novel or a story that serves as such a marker. Terminal is mine. I felt very attached to the character of Tommy, and for good reason. Except for the fact that he has terminal cancer and the bank robbery, Tommy was pretty much me as I'd been 10 years before I began writing professionally. I was working in a foundry for very little pay. I was living in a trailer with a young wife and child, and desperately trying to make ends meet. I knew Tommy. I knew his friends. Most importantly, I knew the desperation he felt. I wasn't so far removed from it at that point that I could no longer capture it. Indeed, on a beginning writer's salary, I sometimes still felt that way. At the end of those 6 months, I finished both manuscripts and turned them in to their respective publishers. Meanwhile, Bloodletting Press published the novella version of Terminal. It sold out during pre-orders. The folks who read it loved it. Bantam saw those reviews and got excited. And let's pause right here. Okay, let's pause right here and examine the limited edition. So this is the hardcover. This is the novella, the shorter version. Okay, always loved this cover by Alan Clark, who also did the cover to Fear of Gravity, as we saw in our last video. This is what the book looks like inside. It was limited to 400 copies. And then here was the lettered edition. That is metal. That is not leather. That is metal. And it's designed to look like a bank. Keene Community Savings. Brian Keene, Alan M. Clark, you know, there we go. Get the glare off. I mean, this is a book that you could kill somebody with. When you open it up, there's the hardcover inside. And this is 3D, by the way. And has my name there. If you were a customer who bought it, it probably had your number, I believe, or maybe it did have the customer names. I don't know. If one of you is watching this and owns it, let me know. So that was a limited edition. Now comes the mass market paperback. And let's go back to the introduction to the author's preferred version. So the folks who read that limited edition loved it. Bantam saw those reviews and got excited. They told Rich and myself that this was going to be a big book for Random House and a big book for me. This would elevate me into Stephen King territory. I remember them saying that. They were believers, but none of them, other than Rich, had actually even read this fucking novel yet. Now, the differences between the novella and this paperback were numerous. This novel was over 30,000 words longer, nearly twice the size of the novella. And it included characters and situations that never appeared or occurred in the novella. The novel delved much deeper into the characters. Most importantly, like I said earlier, the novel originally got into religious territory that the novella only briefly touched on. But readers never ever got a chance to see any of that. Rich left Random House before Terminal was ever published. Bantam then decided they weren't going to launch a new horror line after all. Tom Piccirilli and I were orphaned. For those of you who don't know what that means in publishing, basically being orphaned means we no longer have an advocate at the publisher. The editor who replaced Rich told Tom and I that the higher-ups wanted us to write dark fantasy novels instead. The book Pick had turned into them. Pick was always my name for Tom. I'm sorry, I'm getting emotional thinking about Pick and this time in our history together. The book he had turned into them could certainly be classified as dark fantasy. Tom had always been a master at blending genres anyway, but me, I was screwed. Terminal was to dark fantasy what Quentin Tarantino's films are to romantic teen comedies. I figured they'd just reject the book and return my rights, but to my surprise, they still wanted to publish Terminal, but with some stipulations. I was told to cut all of the religious stuff, because if I didn't, Walmart wouldn't carry my book. I don't know if that was true or not, but I made the changes. I hated myself for it. It felt wrong. This was no longer the book that I wanted to write, the book that you're looking at right now. Not to mention the religious aspects had been part of the pitch that Rich had accepted and for which I'd signed a contract for. But at that point, I'd written and published one novel, The Rising, and 2 collections, No Rest for the Wicked and 4x4. Fear of Gravity was in progress. I had zero negotiating power. So, for example, again, without spoilers, in the novella, the character's mother says he's the product of immaculate conception. Originally, in this version, I had expanded upon that at length, but I was forced to cut all of it. And so in the published version of this novel, she simply says she doesn't know who the father is. Theologically, that's very different than saying that he has no father. I reluctantly made those changes and more like them, and again, I hated myself for it. These days, I'm lucky and privileged enough where no publisher can make me do that if I didn't want to. But back then, I had no power. I had to acquiesce. Terminal and City of the Dead hit bookstores around the same time. City of the Dead sold very well and continues to sell very well to this day. Meanwhile, Terminal, despite the promises and assurances of Bantam's marketing team, was saddled with this lackluster cover, and I'm sorry, but this cover sucks out loud. It had almost no marketing or promotion, and it did not sell at all. Bookstores reordered City of the Dead when it sold out. Terminal got returned to the publisher when it didn't sell. This book bombed. It almost killed my career. much like Richard Lehman's second novel, The Woods Are Dark, almost killed his career here in the US. Not only did the book not launch me into Stephen King territory that they'd promised, it convinced booksellers and publishers that the only thing my audience would accept from me was straight up horror novels. And the irony was that in its original form, Terminal would have been just that. It was a horror crime hybrid that I think would have satisfied most readers. For many years after that, I wasn't allowed to take chances. I stuck to writing straight up horror novels. Occasionally, I'd put out a collection of nonfiction, but even that was mostly focused on horror. It wasn't until years later, when Joe Lansdale convinced me to write The Lost Level, that I tried branching out of the horror genre again. And we'll get into that when we get to The Lost Level. Curiously, despite all the poor sales, Terminal found a cult audience over time. Word of mouth did what the almost non-existent marketing campaign couldn't. Friends bought copies for other people and forced the book into the hands of others and said, "You got to read this." Then those people did the same thing. So eventually, Terminal did get a second printing, despite the fact that it bombed. Then a third and a fourth, and so on. It was optioned for film, never got made. It was optioned for a stage play. I got to go to the debut showing of the play. It was very cool and surreal. The novel got another little burst of popularity when Breaking Bad first aired. People said to their friends, "Oh, if you like this new show Breaking Bad, you'll really like this novel that came out a few years ago." Interviewers have asked me over the years if I felt that Breaking Bad ripped me off, and this is probably a good opportunity to state unequivocally that I do not feel that way. The stories do share a similar premise, but they are notably different tales. And although Terminal came out first, I have to think its weak sales probably meant that none of the Breaking Bad creators ever read it. Anyway, I'm going to stop reading now and actually talk to you. Terminal managed to stay in print despite the fact that it was never a bestseller. And that caused a problem for me because I couldn't get the rights back to it. And in not being able to get the rights back to it, I couldn't release the version that I had originally turned in. That was until 2021 when I finally got the rights back to the novel. Bantam finally let it go out of print. I got the rights back, and I was finally able to release this version. If you're going to read Terminal, this is the version I would like you to read. This is the author's preferred edition. You can find it on Amazon. You can find it at bookstores. Just look for this cover. This is Terminal as I meant it to be, with all of the religious stuff and everything they made me cut included back in the novel. Okay, this version this is the paperback, obviously. There are also a new limited edition hardcover from Thunderstorm Books, and there is a lettered edition, leather-bound this time, not metal, from Thunderstorm Books. It occurs to me I should have got the play out to show you guys, but I didn't think of that. So, you know what? Let's do that. Let's go over here to the shelf. Now we've knocked over my tea. Yeah, here's the play. Me and playwright Royce Booth. Roy's a real good guy. And this was a really beautiful edition. That's what the limited edition looks like. And look at that. It's a play based on Terminal. There was also, I didn't get all the foreign editions out, but I did get out the Spanish edition to show you. This is still in print. This is not the author's preferred version. This is actually based on the Bantam version. I'm not crazy about this cover either, but it's still better than the Bantam cover. But yeah, that is the history of Terminal. It should have been a lot more, meaning its history, not this video. If things had gone differently, who knows what would have happened with my career. But I persevered, and in the end, I triumphed. And I remain very proud of this novel. And I'm delighted anytime somebody tells me it's their favorite. Although I always follow it up and ask them, which version have you read? And if they haven't read this version, I beg them to do so. So anyway, that is today's Secret History. This was a long one, and I apologize, but there's a long history behind this book. Next time, we will talk about City of the Dead, which was being written while I was writing this. We'll also talk a little bit about the promotional tour that I did for these two books. It was called the Terminal Cities Tour. It was my first solo tour. I had, as we've talked about in previous secret histories, I'd gone on tour for 4x4 and No Rest for the Wicked, but other folks were with me. This was the first solo tour that I did, and it was the first extensive nationwide tour that I did. A lot of stories in that to tell. So thanks for watching, and we will see you next time. Peace.